Hey there, this is Max from Epic Games. In this video series, I'm going to show you how to extend the editor with plugins. Every time you work in the editor, you're mostly working with some type of content asset, such as textures, materials, blueprints, or static meshes. So as a use case for this tutorial, we're going to create a plugin that adds a new type of asset that might come in handy at some time during your project. Now this tutorial is mainly aimed at programmers, but even if you're not a programmer, or maybe you program only some of the time, the information in this video might be useful to you. Now before we get started, there are a few things that we need to have installed on our computer. First, of course, you need to have Unreal Engine 4. If you don't have it already, you can download it from our website. The next thing you need for writing code in UE4 is an integrated development environment. For the purpose of this tutorial, we're going to use Visual Studio 2015. We also support VS 2017, or if you're not a Windows person but you prefer to work on Mac, you could use Xcode, or on Linux you could use a variety of other IDEs such as CLion, CodeLight, Kdevelop, or Qt Creator. The engine, after you download it, already includes all the source code files that are needed to compile a code project or a code plugin, but it does not have the entire implementation of all of UE4. I really recommend that you download the entire engine source code because it will help you better understand how the engine works and how things are implemented. And if you are a licensee, you'll be able to download the source code directly from our Perforce server. Otherwise, you can get it from GitHub. You will need a GitHub account, and you also need to be registered on UnrealEngine.com. And if you go to GitHub, you will see the Unreal Engine repository, and you can grab everything from here. And it includes everything that you may ever need in Unreal Engine 4 programming. Another thing that I recommend using is a refactoring tool, because there's so much code in the engine, it initially becomes difficult to navigate everything and find your way around. We use Visual Assist X internally at Epic, but there are some other tools that work just as well, and they really help you looking up references of functions and types or just searching the code base. And then we also have a Visual Studio extension that we developed internally at Epic Games. It's called Unreal VS, and it adds a little toolbar to Visual Studio, and it also has some other neat features. And one feature that I'm using particularly today is a keybind for building the startup project. There are a number of key bindings that you can add through Unreal VS, and for today's session I bound build startup project to the F7 key, so every time I want to recompile my code I can just press F7. It makes things a little easier. There are also some other tools included, such as a batch builder and a way to regenerate your Visual Studio project files. Now, let me show you how to create a code project. Perhaps you've never done this before. It's actually really simple. The first thing you do is you go to the Unreal Engine launcher, and this is where you have your different versions of Unreal Engine 4 installed. And you see we currently have two versions here. There's 4.15.2, which as of today is the latest version, but 4.16 is right around the corner, and the versions are always a little bit different. The UI is a little different, so I'm going to go ahead and use 4.16 today, but notice that this is the preview version, and I recommend that you don't use preview versions in production because there might still be problems. It's possible that some of the new features aren't fully working yet, and sometimes even some of the old features might be broken or not work correctly, so you have to be careful. I'm going to go ahead and launch the engine. And the first thing that's going to come up is our project browser. And if you've already created projects in the past, this is where you will see existing projects, but this is also where you can create new projects. There are basically two types of projects: blueprint projects and C++ projects. If you work only in blueprints, you don't have to write any code at all. But today, we're actually going to write C++ code. So we're going to switch over to the C++ page here on the New Project tab. And you see there are a number of templates that we ship out of the box. These are basic game types that help you get started if you want to make a particular type of game, like a puzzle game or a first-person shooter. But we won't be implementing a game today, we're just going to work on plugins. So basic code is totally fine, it's sufficient. It includes the bare minimum of code that is needed to compile a C++ project in UE4. We won't need any starter content, so we can leave this selected. By default, new projects will go into your My Documents folder, and we're also going to leave the project name as My Project. And as the last step, I'm going to click the Create Project button here at the bottom right. And now what happens in the background is that the project browser is creating all the directories and files for us on our hard disk that are needed to establish a new code project in UE4. And some of those files will contain some boilerplate code that is always needed to get started. And the launcher will also compile this code for us. So you see it's compiling it right now. And at the end of it, two things will happen. It will launch Visual Studio, which is our environment for writing code. And it will also start up the editor. You see Visual Studio is already up. I'm going to drag it over here to the left. And here's the editor. It came up too. So I have them open side by side. You see it's already loaded our project called My Project. Of course, this is a basic code project, so there's nothing in it. There's not really anything you can do except run it, but nothing really will happen. And then here on the left we have our Visual Studio solution, and you see here as well the My Project is listed as a code project underneath my Visual Studio solution, and there are already a few files and folders here. And one really cool thing about UE4 programming is that you can actually work on your code and in the editor at the same time. So for example, I can go into any of these code files and make some modifications. Let me just touch one of these, enter some line breaks, and save the file. So now it's changed. Now I'm going to press F7 to recompile. Remember, this is the unrevs shortcut that I bound before recording this video. And now Visual Studio is compiling my modified code. Of course, nothing has really changed, but it's compiling it anyway because we touched one of the files. And notice here on the bottom right, we saw a little notification that said hot reload complete. So the editor actually detected that our code was changed and recompiled, and it reloaded the DLL for our game project back into the editor. So we're basically now running the editor with our modified code. That is really useful for iteration times. So you don't have to shut down and restart the editor every single time you make a change in code. All right, let's minimize these for a moment. One thing I would like to show you is the files and directories that the project browser created for us on our hard drive. And I'm going to open up Windows Explorer, and you see I'm in my Documents folder in Unreal Projects, and here's my project. And some of these folders we've already seen in Visual Studio. You see there's binaries, config, content, and so on. There are also a couple of files. Some of these folders are empty. Others already have some other boilerplate files in them. Now, if you compare these side by side with Visual Studio, you notice that some of these folders are actually the same. So the Visual Studio solution, it mirrors to some extent the file structure on disk, but it's only including those files that are also used for programming. Some of the other folders and files that are not used for programming, they will not be shown in Visual Studio. Let's go over the list of files and folders that are created for us by default. There is, of course, the source folder, which is going to have all of our source code. And initially, it contains just a single module, which also has the same name as the project, which is My Project. And then we have the binaries, which will contain the compiled binaries. So each time we compile our project, there's a DLL in here that implements our game project that will be recreated. There's also a config folder. You may already be familiar with that. That's where the configuration files are located. Here are the settings for the editor and the engine and several other subsystems in the engine. The content folder is initially empty. It might just have some starter content or some predefined developer folders they should also be empty here. But as you add content to your project later on, this is where all the content is going to be. Intermediate is going to be used for temp files, mostly by Visual Studio. You can safely delete the contents of these folders at any given time. They will be recreated on demand, but usually you don't ever have to touch this folder. Saved is also another folder that contains configuration files, but in this case these are the configuration files that are created by the editor or by your game at runtime. So while your game is running, the engine actually also writes configuration files. They go in here. And this is where you will also find log files. If something goes wrong and you need to report some error back to us or you need help, you should go into the logs folder and send us the log file. There's usually a lot of helpful information in there. All right, now let's look at some of the files. There are quite a few. For right now, I just want to look at the uProject file at the root of your project. Every project has one of those, and it's also listed in Visual Studio. It should be at the very bottom of your project. There it is. And this file is just it's just a text file, and it's formatted in JSON format. JSON is something that comes from the JavaScript world, and we use this file to basically describe your project. Most of these properties should be self-explanatory. You'll see there's an engine association that describes which version of the engine your project is compatible with, and it also contains the project name. Basically, this information is pulled out by the launcher when you go into the project browser and you see all the projects listed. For example, right here, you can see it has my project 416, and there is some more detail here in the tooltip. All that information comes out of this uProject file descriptor. All right, and that's pretty much all there is to it. So we just created our first code project. You saw it was really easy. So let's sum up what we learned. You need an IDE for writing code. We use Visual Studio for this particular tutorial, but there are other IDEs that you can use as well. You can easily create a new project from the launcher. You can also create projects from the editor. I haven't shown that, but it's possible too. Each project contains a number of directories and files by default, and those files are always created for you, and then over time you will add more files to it. And projects are described by uProject descriptor files, and the modules in your project are hot reloadable, so you can keep your coding environment and the Unreal editor open at the same time. And like I said, I recommend that you get the entire engine source code. It will really help you learn UE4 much faster, and refactoring tools are great for assisting you in that work. All right, that was it. So in our next video, we're going to look at how to add a code plugin to our project.